CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues is following the latest in Washington. Jeff, you must have been watching the hearing and been completely enthralled considering your area of expertise. And we learned that, the Russians have a long history of meddling in other countries' affairs, but also in American affairs. But there was something about this presidential election that they were particularly engaged here. They were particularly bold. Why was that?
Well, it's a new approach to warfare. This is what the Russians are doing now, according to U.S. officials that we've spoken to over several months now. This is something that we've really been digging into here at CBS News. And what we've found is that law enforcement officials here in the U.S. and intelligence officials here in the U.S. have been concerned about this level of Russian cyber attacks for some time. This was a concerted effort, they say, on the part of the Russian government to interfere in this country's business, essentially, to find ways to exploit divisions in this country. And according to U.S. officials, the Russians were doing this with this information warfare by spreading fake and false information and then inflaming situations. For example, Occupy Wall Street protests, Black Lives Matter protests, by using harnessing the power of social media, if you will, and then amplifying messages to inflame these divisions. So this is a form of Russian information warfare. According to the people that we've been talking to over the last several months, they have done it in the Ukraine, according to U.S. officials. They are trying to do it now in Europe, according to U.S. officials. And this is all part of a plan on the part of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin specifically to disrupt democracies and disrupt U.S. allies and the U.S. itself. And so this is something that has been talked about in law enforcement circles for quite some time as this has unfolded. The problem is the issue has sort of been clouded by politics, if you will, with the election ongoing. Folks started blending these issues together, and it became more of a political issue rather than a national security issue in a lot of ways. So what we're seeing with this hearing is that this issue is rising in the public's view and perhaps gaining more interest. But this is information that we have known for some time because U.S. law enforcement officials have been watching this happening, these cyber attacks on the part of these Russian hacking units and then the spread of this false information.
Jeff, one geopolitical analyst described this to me as the Russians playing the long game. In other words, we talk a lot about the end of the Cold War, but this analyst told me that we're still at war with the Russians because there is an end game, and that is, for example, as you've pointed out and others, the disruption of Europe, the breaking up of NATO, if that's possible, for example, Brexit, and now even our election. So what can the United States do to prevent this and perhaps even win this sort of cyber war?
Well, listen, that's a very good question, and there are people in Congress who are concerned that the U.S. really has not developed a strategy here because, again, the issue has been somewhat politicized, and so there hasn't really been a lot of focus on the end game here. How do you respond to this level of cyber activity, this level of interference by an adversary? There's really no strategy in place. And so there are people on Capitol Hill, specifically Arizona Senator John McCain, who has talked about this at length. What are we as a nation going to do to respond to this type of interference? And what you're seeing now with this Senate intelligence hearing, we're at the beginning of that hearing. But what will come out of that hearing is the fact that there was Russian meddling during the 2016 campaign. The other issues, whether there was coordination with the Trump campaign, that's a separate issue here. But what will be determined, because law enforcement believes that they have the evidence to back this up, they have high confidence that this was Russian interference in the 2016 election. So what that means is, at the time that this Senate Intelligence Committee comes to a conclusion, Congress will then have to grapple with, all right, so what do we do next? How do we respond to this level of interference by an adversary? And right now, there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill and in other places who don't feel like there is an adequate strategy in place to respond to this type of interference.
And I found it quite interesting yesterday, Jeff, that when Sean Spicer, the press secretary, was asked about this, what changes the administration is making to combat this, he sort of gave a generic response that I think left a lot of people wanting. So I guess there will be a lot of digging into that. Jeff Pegues, sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
Well, you're right. And it's not just the Trump administration. There are people who felt as if the Obama administration did not respond adequately as well. And so there are issues with the response on both sides of the aisle. But at some point, both sides of the aisle are going to have to come together to figure out a response, to figure out a strategy going forward.
Absolutely right. It cannot remain a partisan issue. Jeff Pegues in Washington for us. Thank you, Jeff.